When does that get... when does that go away? Irish music ever go away? Okay. Since I'm sort of one. Okay, now for our... actually, the penultimate speech today will be from General Perkins, who will give the TRADOC perspective. And how about a nice, warm St. Patrick's Day welcome for General David Perkins, Commanding General, United States Army Training and Doctrine Command.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. Well, sir, thanks a lot. I'm not sure the penultimate speech is sort of an expectation I want to live up to, but I do appreciate some time to come out here and speak a little bit. First of all, thanks to AUSA and all the leadership for continuing to be great supporters of the United States Army and by association the United States of America. To Dennis Vi and the AMC crowd that do such a great job hosting us when we're here. Dennis is sort of the pseudo-mayor here of Huntsville and really does this particularly well. And of course, General Sullivan, to you personally, as you transition out and we get another great soldier in Carter Ham, it is a legacy you're leaving behind, not just your time as a chief, but here at AUSA. And similar to what I think Secretary Murphy was talking about, I don't remember being a soldier in the Army without a General Sullivan around, either as the chief or at AUSA, which is equally important in many ways. And we were actually talking to General Sullivan and Bob Brown and some others in the green room before the secretary spoke, and so we're drinking coffee and telling war stories, that's what soldiers do in the morning. They drink coffee and tell war stories. And one of the things we're talking about is the influence when you get to be old guys like us that you may not realize you've had. And I always tell folks we always underestimate the influence we have from us down, and we always focus on what's not going right above us. And so we were telling various war stories about folks we'd run into in the Army many years later, and they talk about that. So I'll give a quick one of a young Lieutenant Colonel Perkins is a G3 of 1st Infantry Division. At that time, it was over in Europe, and General AUSA was my division commander, another great American, and General Sullivan was coming over as a former division commander of 1ID to speak with it, etc. like that, and I'd never met him, but of course I knew him by reputation, and General AUSA said, hey, G3, you need to come with me to dinner tonight and meet General Sullivan, etc. like that, because at that time the G3 shop was up in the attic there at Würzburg, and he knew that I didn't get out much as a G3. He's like, just come out, we'll give you a schnitzel dinner, have some German beer, etc. And so I went to dinner as the lowly G3, used to being sort of kind of behind the scenes, knew that. So the CG's there talking to General Sullivan and talking about Big Red One stories, etc. like that. And then to this day, I remember that. Then sort of we have our schnitzel, we have our German beer, etc. And then General Sullivan kind of leaves the CG and kind of focuses on the G3, which is, I've learned that that's not always a good thing as a G3. Someone's going to be like, okay, what's screwed up now? And he says, hey, G3, come here. And he starts really just putting his arm around me saying, look, now here's the secret to being a good G3. This is what a division commander expects from him. You got to do this, etc. And he's mentoring me, and he never really met me before. And so he's mentoring me in this German Gasthaus about what's going on. And I'd never met him before. And from then on, every time he'd see me, he'd say, hey, Dave, how's XYZ going on as I continue to go through my career? I'm like, really? General Sullivan remembers me, remembers my first name, and the first time we ever met, he made an effort to pull me aside and coach teach, mentor me. And sir, ever since then, you've given me great counsel and wisdom and mentorship, probably like everybody in this room. So thanks. So you don't know the influence you've had, and you probably don't remember that, all the kind of things we talked about this morning. So thanks personally from Dave Perkins, but more importantly, thanks for the United States Army for everybody you've touched. They all have a General Sullivan story. They all can remember when you pulled them aside, put your arm around them and said, look, here's what you have to do. So thanks a lot, sir. And And I'm sure you, like all of us, have underestimated the influence that you've had both below you and above you. Secretary, thanks for coming back for this. It's an honor and a pleasure to serve with you. As I tell folks, it's always been an honor to serve in any job I've had in the Army, but not always been a pleasure to work for the boss I've had it. I said I've never had a bad job in the Army, but there's people I've worked for I'd rather not work for again. In this case, it's an honor and a pleasure to work with you, and for all the other leaders up there. What I'm going to do here today is a couple things. I was here last year and talked about our Army operating concept, and I know that you've had some panels with H.R. McMaster and Bo Dice and a lot of the Arctic folks about following on from the Army operating concept. And so I'll kind of review that a little bit. I think we have some repeat offenders here and some new people. I'll put out a couple of reminders about sort of those first order principles. And then what I'm going to do is tell you how we're going to sort of operationalize that. What does it mean? I know yesterday I think was the Big 8 panel. I'd like to talk about that a little bit and contextualize it, and then open it up for some Q&A. So if you can put up the first picture there. So as a former armor officer, I mainly have pictures here that I'll talk about. This is the one, I showed it last year, the Win in a Complex World, kind of a visualization of it. And you've heard discussions here the last couple of days. We define complex as the operating environment that we'll operate in is unknown, unknowable, constantly changing, unpredictable, et cetera, like that. So it's very different than, in some ways, the environment that initially I came into the Army at the height of the Cold War as an armor officer. Was sent to Germany, which is where all good armor officers belonged at the height of the Cold War. And they said, hey, okay, Lieutenant Perkins, here's your deal. Take your 5, as I date myself, your 5 M60 non-rise, non-passive tanks, and you're going to dig them in here at this 1,500 meters of your doctrinal space, and then when the first echelon comes over, you kill them, the second echelon comes over, et cetera, like that. And so it was a known enemy, the Soviet Union, in a known part of the world, the Central Plains of Europe, with a known coalition, NATO, and that coalition didn't change much. Hard to get in NATO, hard to get out of NATO. It's not like I'm in NATO on Monday, I'm out Wednesday, I pay my dues, I'm back in Thursday. So it was a very known construct, and so we built an army a certain way and developed leaders to deal with a known problem set, a known part of the world, with sort of known rules of the road. As we look to the future, we're saying, you know what? That's not the world we're going to have. We don't know who the enemy is going to be. We don't know where they're going to fight them. We don't know what the coalition is going to be. And so the way that we developed this Lieutenant Perkins was, what we want you to do is every 90 days you go up to the General Defense Plan and you recon it. And you go to where your tanks are and you get in a Jeep and you figure out how long it takes you to drive from A to B, et cetera, like that. And then we're going to rehearse this every year. Redeployment of forces to Germany. We'll rehearse the road march tables. We'll rehearse the deployment plan, et cetera, like that. And then you have lunch with the Germans on your right and dinner with the Brits on your left. You know who they are. And Perkins, what we want you to do is we want to train you to know more about something you know a lot about already. And we want you to rehearse it over and over and over again. You've got your battle book in your safe with your map and your acetate overlay. Every time you go on a recon every 90 days, you update the little power lines and the bridges that change, et cetera. Because when World War III hits, we want you to execute a script, Perkins. You just open your battle book. Don't be late to the bridge crossing. If you're late, you'll tie up 7th Corps. If you're too early, you'll tie up 5th Corps, and et cetera, like that. The problem is that's not the world that the Lieutenant Perkins of today operates in. And by the way, there is a Lieutenant Perkins out there today. Because we can't tell him, hey, this is the 1,500 meters you go to. This is where you're going. We can't tell him who his coalition partners are. We can't tell him if he's going to go to the Baltics or the Balkans or the Mideast or North Korea. These aren't policy projections here. They're just possibilities. And so, and we can't say, and Perkins, you're going to rehearse this, etc. like that. We can't tell that Lieutenant Perkins much. The only thing we can tell Lieutenant Perkins is you're not going to be able to recon it every 90 days. Not like the old Lieutenant Perkins who reconned it every 9 days. In fact, the first time you'll ever know anything about that place is when you deploy there for war. So now how do you train and develop the Lieutenant Perkins of today, and how you build an army of today to deal with that world this very differently? Well, that's what we've said here, sort of this win in a complex world. a world that's constantly changing. And it has .mil.pf ramifications, doctrine, organization, training, leader development, et cetera, like that. And what we've done is, to deal with that world, we said there's probably some capabilities that the Army needs to have. And I'll highlight a couple here and then kind of use that as a segue into the discussion of the Big Eight, but then more importantly, what that means as we look out. I know we have a lot of industry partners here that may give you some insight into how we are looking at things and looking at things a little bit differently. So a couple of things I'll bring here. What we want to do, you can see right there, is present multiple dilemmas to the enemy. Because we don't know who the enemy is, we don't know where we're going to fight them, but we have to have multiple capabilities because two things are for sure. One, we don't know who the enemy is, therefore we don't know what capability they have, so I can't just buy something that'll defeat a T-72 tank because I don't know if that's even what I'll face. So I have to have multiple capabilities to present multiple dilemmas. The other thing is, what we are finding in today, and we all live it, that the rate of improvement of technology, the flattening of the earth, things change at such a high rate that if I have a dilemma for the enemy, that it is temporal in nature. It will only work for a short period of time, and then the enemy is going to quickly figure out how to mitigate that. So I will not have a differential asymmetric capability for long. I might have it initially, and then the enemy's going to figure it out. So what we say is, in the Army, we want to have a high rate of innovation. We want to innovate very quickly. We want our leaders to be critical thinkers, and I think Bob Brown and his folks are going to talk about that. The human element is becoming more and more important because in many ways, that is the weakest link when it comes to increased rate of innovation. And so I have to go into the fight knowing that whatever I have today and whatever I'm working, and whatever's working today, it will only work for a while. And then the enemy is going to figure out, they will emulate our capabilities, they'll avoid our strengths, they will figure out a way to get around that, and we have to be 1 or 2 steps ahead of them. So that means we've got to buy material differently, we buy different material, and we train and develop our leaders very differently. And then when we talk about this, when we say present multiple dilemmas to the enemy, we want to present multiple options to our commanders and to our decision makers. It can't just be a one-trick pony. We have to have multiple options to get at this thing from the tactical, operational, and strategic level of war. And so now we've got to figure out, well, how do you go about doing that? And one of the changes as we're driving through this is every solution is not, the solution is not going to be a thing. Just buying one thing is not going to be the solution to it. You know, get a new laser pointer. Once you get the best laser pointer out there, that's the solution to everything. Or the new tank or the new whatever. It's how do you develop capabilities? And so we're focusing away from just saying, I'm going to buy this thing, to I'm going to build this capability. And I was talking to some folks early here, and I said, so when we talk about the future of the Army, there's 2 parts to it. One is thinking about it, but just thinking about it is not enough. In fact, I tell folks, honestly, we don't lack for a lot of good ideas. What we have to do is not just think about the future, but we have to build the future. Because the Army is not a think tank. We have great thinkers in it, but we don't just generate ideas. We actually have to build an Army. We have to build the future. So we have to think about it, but then we've got to transition into building it. And that's what we've been working our way through, is actually how do you build the future Army based on what you're thinking about. And if you go to the next slide, so we've defined the environment as one that's constantly changing, unpredictable, et cetera. And we said what we need are capabilities of which we can have a high rate of innovation to stay 1 and 2 steps ahead of the enemy. And so we said, but the Army is a very big organization, as the Secretary was talking about, and a lot of things going on. But we've got to be able to kind of focus the leadership. And so you've seen testimony as early as yesterday, I think, with the Chief and the Secretary about acquisition reform. Let's put the Secretary and the Chiefs more in the center of acquisition, decision-making, et cetera. So what we said, part of how you're actually going to produce an output, build the Army, is how do we focus our leadership on the things that will produce the biggest return on investment. So a great model we look back at in the Army I grew up in of 100-5 and air-land battle was the Big Five that we're very familiar with. We said, you know, that worked, and and the Army only didn't do those 5 things, but it was a very powerful construct because then they say, you know, these 5 things are really going to drive a lot that happens in the Army. In other words, if you buy a tank, you've got to buy a fueler, HEMIT, you've got to train mechanics, you've got to build a national training center to train it. There's a lot of other things that are going on, but those 5 things help solidify and drive change. So we used that paradigm, but we said the world we're going to in the future, it's not just things. The solution to it is not just going to be a tank or an Apache. It's going to be a capability. So we've got it down to 8 here, very scientifically done, because I said, well, we don't want 10, because then you'd get like David Letterman's top 10. So 10's a bad number. We used to have the big 5, but we don't want to just copy that. The world's a little bit more complicated, so 8 seemed like a good number. The question isn't always what are up there. The issue is what's not up there, you know, because somebody's got their thing. They're like, how come my thing's not up there? I want my thing to be part of it. So we've tried to broaden it up, but if you take a look at these are capabilities. It's not a thing, okay? And then over here we have sort of the imperatives or characteristics of the solution sets to build these capabilities. So let me focus one right here, advanced protection. What we're saying is if the rate of change is getting faster and faster in the world, then we've got to have an ability to create a high rate of innovation. And so when we take a look, in this case, it could be our combat vehicles, our aviation vehicles, what we're trying to do is determine those things that change the quickest. Because that is, again, as we've said, that's sort of our vision, the future is this high rate of innovation. And what we are finding is that one of the things that is changing the quickest is the threats to our soldiers, our vehicles, our aircraft. The threats are increasing at a higher rate than we can protect the vehicles. 2 ways they're increasing at a higher rate. One is the technology itself, and the other is what I would call sort of the economic exchange ratio. In that, as we have our tanks, and I know I sound parochial as a former armor officer talking about tanks, but what we're finding is the ability to defeat a tank is becoming much, much cheaper than it is to build a tank. And the ability to field a threat to the tank is becoming pretty easy. You can take ATGM-6 and then give them ATGM-7. They don't have to go to a 20-week course, et cetera. And then, unfortunately, our enemies can defeat our tanks at a high rate of change. They can improve their technology very quickly, and it's much cheaper. So he said, so therefore, what we have to do is take a look, and I'm talking about a combat vehicle, what is the part that we're getting behind the economic power curve as well as the technology power curve, and one of it is protection. So therefore, we're saying, therefore, the parts that change the most rapidly within the capability, you've got to make the ability to innovate much easier. In other words, you can't hardwire that in, because as we look to the future, and our great intel folks and others say, you know what, these are the areas that we think are going to increase the most rapidly, and the threats to our systems are one of them. So therefore, a tank right now, the protection of a tank is hardwired onto that tank. So you have a tank, you've got your 72 tons of various types of armor, et cetera, like that, but you don't change that easily. You know, if all of a sudden they come up with a new ATGM, say, okay, you know, send it back to the tank plant, recast the hull or whatever like that, it's going to be a long time, and you can't. So the ability to defeat it, you can innovate much quicker because we've hardwired the protection of the tank. It's hardwired into that tank. So what we're saying is we can't, the things that will change the quickest, you can't hardwire that in. That's why the human dimension aspect of it. We've got to have critical thinking. You can't just say, here's the battle drill, and that's the battle drill used for everything. We can't hardwire our soldiers. Well, we can't hardwire the tank. So what we're saying is we've got to have protection systems that literally, for lack of a better term, you bolt it on. And then therefore, when the enemy develops a new ATGM, I either tweak the software, I do a few modifications, or I bolt another one on. The soldier doesn't have to go back to 20 weeks of training. The tank doesn't have to go back to the depot to be recast or whatever. I can innovate the protection of the tank, at least to keep up with the threat of it. And what would be even better is that I can innovate the protection of the tank at a cheaper cost than it takes to defeat it. It's a different way of thinking. That's why, you know, I like the secretary was up on the Hill yesterday talking with our board of directors, a nice friendly conversation. And a lot of times I'm out there, they're like, hey, Perkins, where's your shopping list? What do you want to buy? Because, you know, the appropriators especially. Perkins, what do you want to buy? I said, you know, I don't want to buy things. I want to build capability. We need to build capability. I'm not buying the future of the Army. I'm building the future of the Army. I need capability. I need an ability to be able to advance my protection cheaper and more quickly than the enemy can get after it. Well, how do you do that? There's lots of different ways, and it's not the ways that we've been doing it historically. So now we've said, okay, here are some imperatives over here. Emphasize the integration of the technology with the soldiers. If I buy a piece of technology, but it is too hard for the soldiers to learn how to use it and integrate it, it's not a capability. It's a piece of technology, but it's not a capability because it's got to be integrated with the soldiers. I've got to simplify systems so I can integrate them quickly because my threat's going to innovate quickly, so I've got to be able to deliver a capability, not a thing, a capability more quickly than my enemy can deliver it. And so we have characteristics saying, you know what, if these are not part of the technological solution to these capabilities over here, we're going to have a problem. But the good news is this really plays to the American Army's strength, and it plays to the strength really of our culture. So I was out, and that is empowering soldiers led by great non-commissioned officers. So I was out at AWA last fall, and we had a number of things that were out there working with the great soldiers from 1st Armored Division, and we're putting things in their hands to innovate with and figure out. And one of the problems is, micro UAVs, sort of, the quadcopters, all the smaller things that we're familiar with that, quite honestly, around the world we're seeing proliferating, and so we've got to figure out how do we build a capability to deal with these small UAVs that can come at you in swarms, et cetera, like that. And we had a close ally of ours that we've worked with that has faced these in combat. And one of the things they did with a very inexpensive, probably a $500 UAV that you could buy at Radio Shack at Walmart, they used a $1 million air defense missile and shot it down. Well, it worked. We won that kinetic exchange ratio. We won that kinetic exchange ratio. That multi-million-dollar air defense missile shot down the $500 quadcopter. The problem is we lost the economic exchange ratio. And so what I tell folks is I can't keep coming up with $1 million solutions to $100 problems. Because if I have $1 million solution to a $100 problem, that does not create a dilemma for the enemy. That creates a dilemma for me. Back to first order principles. We say we want to create multiple dilemmas for the enemy. So what I have to do, I need a $10 solution to a $100 problem, not a $1 million solution to a $100 problem. So with that in mind, I was out at AWA, and so we're saying, let's figure out how we deal with these swarm UAVs, et cetera, like that. So they said, sir, here's something we're going to show you. Come on out there. So I come out there, and there's this kind of platypus-looking vehicle. It's a version of a MRAP, and there's things bolted onto it, et cetera, like that. I go up into the cab, and there's a Sergeant E5 in there from Steph Twitty's 1st Armored Division. And I said, so what do you got here, Sergeant? He goes, okay, sir, here's what we got. I got a bunch of screens. I got this controller, and they're going to bring these UAVs at us. And instead of shooting them down with multi-million-dollar air defense missiles, what we're going to do is we're going to shoot electrons at them. We're going to shoot electrons at them and bring them down by jamming, use electrons. And so, electrons are much cheaper once you generate them, than a multi-million-dollar missile. And plus, you can deal with swarms, et cetera, like that. So he had this, again, platypus-looking vehicle with cables going out to an electronic warfare device. It's over here. We had our cyber guys there, had this sergeant up there, and he said, okay, so what's going to happen, sir, is they're going to start flying these UAVs at me, and then we're going to bring them down, et cetera, like that. So get in here, and here they come. And he's pointing at the screen. Sir, see this, and I couldn't see crap, but okay, whatever. I got it. And he goes, sir, I got one here, and they're coming down all over the place. And he says, now, sir, what we got to do is we got to deconflict with airspace because we don't want to bring down an Apache. We only want to bring this down. So I coordinate, do my airspace coordination stuff, and we do this, et cetera, like that. And this kid's really onto it. And I said, so what do you think about this? He said, well, when I got here, it didn't work quite right, and the screens weren't right. So we got with the screens, and then, the controller wasn't right. So I go with the contractor. We took the controller apart. We did this, and it wasn't working right here. So, he said, yeah, I kind of sat with the controller, and we innovated. We fixed this whole thing, and now it works like a champ. I'm like, wow, very impressive. And he's talking about deconflicting airspace. So I said, wow, how long have you been, in air defense? How long have you been in air defense? You see now that guy goes, sir, I'm not an air defender. He says, I'm a artilleryman. I'm like, wow. I said, you seem to have this down pat, airspace deconfliction, coordination, all this kind of stuff like that. I said, it's amazing that as a non-air defender, you seem to have this whole airspace thing under control. And he goes, well, sir, I've been at this a long time. I said, oh, really? How long? He said, sir, I've been out here all week. So see, that's a high rate of innovation. You take a soldier, E5, and of course in his life, a week is a long time. You get some kit in his hand, and most of it is stuff the United States Army owned already, and we kind of repurposed it. You give him kind of the big picture of what has to happen, and then you empower him. You say, this is what I want to be able to do, and then you work with him closely, put him in a unit formation, and you start developing a capability. It wasn't about buying a particular thing. It was about innovating, developing a capability, and probably whatever solution we came up with, if we were to go to war with that, it would probably work for a while. And then probably the enemy would figure it out. He'd change frequencies. He'd do something else. So we would have to empower and develop that leader to say, you know what I'm doing is only going to work for a while, but I think the countermeasure is going to be able to do this. I'm already thinking through how I'm going to recalibrate this and get on the next thing, et cetera, like that. And that's what we have to leverage, because that is the strength in the American Army. Our great soldiers with well-led units with non-commissioned officers, and then leveraging the technology that our society produces so prolifically. But we've got to embed it, we've got to bring it into the Army at a much quicker rate, at an economic exchange ratio that gives us $10 solutions to $100 problems, because that's what the United States does so well. That's what the United States Army does so well. And that is the great public-private partnership here, is that we're using the essence of the United States, which are, great Americans. They're intellectually curious. They like to be empowered, yet also want to make sure they're part of a great disciplined organization. And what I've seen is they can do unbelievable things. And actually, they do these things almost intuitively. Our soldiers intuitively do these things. They don't have to go to school on this, okay? We've just got to make sure that we sort of empower them. What I'd like to do is to open it up for questions across the board here. And I think we've got some collected up there. And I don't have my glasses, sir, so if you can sort of just, if you could, sir.
Okay, so we have a question that came to us online. As you know, it's being streamed. Given the growing impact of information on the operational environment and adversaries' expert manipulation of that information, what is the U.S. Army doing to prepare for the future of information warfare?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and we're seeing it in the Ukraine and other places like that. So when we take a look at actually our operating environment, one of the things we say is we have to operate in all contested spaces and domain, and one of them is information. We have to know that will be contested from the very beginning, and therefore two things. One, we have to make our leaders very comfortable with that, which means they need to understand what the enemy is going to do from an information point of view. And the other thing is, we've got to figure out how we operate in that, both from a military point of view, and as we've talked about and the Secretary said, and how do we deliver all elements of national power. So what we say in the Army operating concept is we have to synchronize and deliver not only firepower, but synchronize and deliver all elements of national power. So when you start talking about the information aspect in the information domain, that's where you really start getting into political information, economic information, much more than just a kinetic exchange of activity out there. So as we run folks through Command General Staff College, Captain's Career Course, et cetera, we're saying, look, gone are the days where you can just operate in the land domain. And that's hard enough, just kind of getting your stuff together in the land domain. You are going to have to be cognizant of all domains out there. The cyber domain, information domain. You'll see when you look at the Big 8, we talk about cross-domain fires. The soldiers of today have to look at a very holistic environment out there and be very comfortable in operating in all those. And so the information one in particular has a huge all elements of national policy to it, not just what the infantry squad brings to bear.
Second question, sir. How significant is the stand-up of the Cyber Center of Excellence to the TRADOC mission to prepare for the future?
So I think this is a great news story on part of the United States Army. Almost, I think everything about the United States Army is a great news story. I know that sounds parochial as a soldier. So this year, or the end of last year, we stood up Cyber Branch, okay? So it's a new branch. The last time, does anyone know what the last branch the United States Army stood up? Yeah, Special Operations Forces. So we don't do this often, okay? We don't stand up a new branch often. So the last one we stood up was soft, and that worked out pretty well for us. So cyber is now a branch. And I'd like to point out a couple of things on how the Army has approached it. So the other services have taken different views of it. One service puts cyber in with its intelligence community. Another service puts cyber in with its communications enterprise. When we looked at it from the Army point of view, we said, you know what? People would ask me, well, who owns cyber? Because cyber is a domain, both in our doctrine and joint doctrine, like land's a domain, maritime domain, airspace. They'd be like, who owns the cyber domain? Is it the Intel folks? Is it the Signal folks? I said, oh, we've already figured that out. They're like, well, of course you guys have. You're a trade-off. You know everything. I said, no, we figured it out a long time ago. Do you know who owns the cyber domain? The same person that owns the land domain, the commander. The commander owns it. A branch doesn't own it. The commander owns it. And what does the United States Army do in all the domains? We conduct combined arms maneuver through that domain. We maneuver through the domain. So we maneuver through cyber. So by standing up the Cyber Center of Excellence and saying it is a branch and a domain, what we're saying is we are going to have to maneuver through cyber like we maneuver through land. And, oh, by the way, the only people that have to know about this are not just the cyber people. And this is the importance of having a proponent. If you talk to Major General Steve Fogarty, a great American and probably one of the foremost authorities on cyber, so we're very lucky to have him in the Army and down there at Fort Gordon, what they start to realize is just like if you're the proponent, I saw Darrell Williams here, if you're out at CASCOM for our multifunctional logisticians, there he is right there. What you're responsible for is not just teaching logistics to logisticians, but down in Fort Benning, we teach about logistics. Out of Fort Huachuca, we teach about logistics. We teach about fires at Fort Benning, even though the fire center is a proponent. So what Fort Gordon is doing is not only training our cyber warriors in the cyber branch, but they are responsible to saying, hey, this is what maneuver people need to know about cyber. This is what logisticians need to know about cyber. This is what the aviators at Rucker need to know about it. So by creating a Cyber Center of Excellence, making it a proponent in a branch, they're responsible for not only training cyber warriors about cyber, but teaching all of the Army about cyber, just like we want all of the Army to know about logistics and intel and fires and all that. So we're taking a very holistic approach. It's not like a niche capability. It's not like fires is a niche capability. It's part of an overall capability of our formation. So I think the extent to which the Army has embraced it and how we're doing it is probably not well known because of that. So thanks for that question.
General Perkins, to innovate faster, we need contracting mechanisms that enable quick response. How is TRADOC working to improve contracting speed?
Yeah, so this is, and you probably saw the testimony actually yesterday of the Secretary and General Milley on this. This is an area of particular focus. A couple of weeks ago, I was out at Silicon Valley meeting with a lot of the high-tech companies out there. And one of the things that comes up all the time for those that innovate very quickly is the term you've heard often is you have to fail fast. Fail fast and cheap, as they say. You know, get an idea, get it out, didn't work, move on to something else. Fail fast and cheap. As compared to, I said that sometimes what happens is we fail slow and expensively. So what we have to do is it takes some pretty dramatic changes in laws and the way we look at stuff to be able to do that. One of the things is we want to be able to conduct rapid prototyping. We need to prototype quicker. And that could be a prototype of a vehicle. It could be prototyping of a formation. It could be prototyping, quite honestly, of a leader development thing. And sometimes we get very focused on the M part of it. And so Army warfighting assessment is a key way that we're doing that holistically. And so we've got to be able to prototype faster, be able to fail quickly, to just kind of shed bad ideas and get to something new quicker than actually the laws allow us to, or even our system does. So that's a big challenge, but we're focusing on it from sort of requirements all the way to the legal portion of it.
That'll be all, sir.
That was the last official one. General Sullivan. Oh. I got it. Well, sir, again, thanks for your service to our nation. Thanks for letting me have you. And I'll be here sort of the afternoon. I know I'm meeting with a lot of industry folks out there, but I'll be happy to follow up on this, and a lot of my folks are here. So thanks a lot, folks. Appreciate it.